It's a fact that we can't move?
Yeah.
That these
Our last dialogue of this semester, and we're about to come. My name is Jennifer, and I will be the moderator for today.
My name is Caleb Lester, I'm a senior, and I'll be the Googler, or the co-Googler of this guy over here. Yes.
I'm Galen Barnhorst, and I'm going to be running around with Mike if you have any questions.
And I'm Corey Dixon, I'm the other co-Googlers.
So let's get started then.
Okay, so today we'll be discussing synthetic or virtual realities. Synthetic or virtual meaning a video game, cinema, or even a simulation through an Oculus Rift. But rather than speculating the possibility of these new technological developments and how they're controlling our designs, this dialogue is a discussion that questions the emerging relationships between the designer, society, and technology. In the 19th century, Coney Island, artificially severed from Manhattan, became a popular destination for those who wanted to get away from the city. Coney Island became a laboratory to explore new technologies, and more importantly, began exploiting this technology for pleasure as opposed to using it to progress. This dreamland became a synthetic reality for citygoers. Our culture today is much the same, that we are constantly pursuing stark extremes to our culture's established status quos, and we are fascinated by these synthetic realities or even dystopias, whether they be Second Life, Bioshock, YouTube, etc. And with these opportunities and technology, we are, for the first time, a generation to submerge ourselves with synthetic realities when ours is not good enough. With the culture so fascinated with the virtual or synthetic reality and architects becoming highly involved with these realities, how do we question its validity in our field? These virtual worlds are not simply composed of architecture, it becomes a routine of the user that uses it, adding constantly to the database, especially in games such as Destiny, who have thousands of players online at one time. The work becomes a sort of artificial psychogeography. The world becomes collaborative, and the architecture truly begins to tell a story, and the user, or avatar, begins to gain spatial ownership through the games. So, with this in mind, is this architecture of the virtual as valid as our physical architecture, or is it simply an extension of our field closely related to mediums like paper architecture or cinematography, and will it become a new learning mechanism and process of architecture that could potentially begin to inform us about the dichotomy between humans and architecture? Do you want to show your small...
Could we show, should I start? Yes, okay. I'd like to just sort of situate, if it's okay with you, I'd like to situate myself in this discussion. About 6 years ago, I started playing Halo with, I have two sons, and who are now 13 and 16, and I started playing Halo with them. Maybe it wasn't 6 years ago, maybe it was more like 4 years ago. Anyway, just so you know when it was when Halo ODST came out, which was one of the major openings of games during this time. And I quickly figured out that I didn't have the reflexes to actually beat my sons who routinely, I just found that I was constantly spawning, and that was pretty much the game. Go to the next one, thanks. So but Tristan, my older son, started playing Mass Effect 3, and I got involved with the campaign, and so I found out, what I started doing is I started having, I would make myself a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and I would sit down with him, and for like an hour and a half or 2 hours, I'd watch him play Mass Effect 3, and it's pretty engaging as a game goes because of the interactive nature of the game. Next one, please. And so, but at the same time, it was pretty engaging because of the kind of worlds that one fought through and the kinds of spaces created. And more I became interested in it. And about the same time, let's see, the people who made Grand Theft Auto made Red Dead Redemption. Grand Theft Auto, in my opinion, is a bankrupt game, even though, by the way, they have made $2 billion off of Grand Theft Auto 5. I started looking at Red Dead Redemption, which you all know probably is a Western. Now, what really intrigued me about Red Dead Redemption was not the gameplay, but the entourage. Fascinated by the entourage, particularly in the way the entourage was structured and how it moved. But of course, the architecture of it was pretty low key because it's set in the West. Next one, please. But we start looking at games like BioShock, where Columbia has its own set of architecture, mostly, in my mind, architectural clues that are really disjointed. It's more like a calico of architectural images. Next one, please. But then, of course, there's Assassin's Creed. At least the first couple Assassin's Creed were indeed real architecture, real cities, nostalgic cities, historic cities, and that as the assassin, you work through. My present to myself when I'm no longer dean is I'm going to go through all the Assassin's Creed. So. And then next slide, please. And then, of course, I'm still a favorite. I still love Bungie. One of the things that really intrigued me when I got interested in Halo is the way in which you could screen capture 3D. So you could capture 3D movement. So, for example, if you're you do a scene where you're fighting aliens with an assault rifle, what you don't see is that with every shot, cartridges are going out the side of the rifle. When you screen capture them in 3D, you come back to that spot, and you see these little things in the air, and you can zero in on them, and you can come around to the back, and you can see the impression mark on the back of the casing. Now, I think, as a level of fidelity, something that we actually find important in architecture, I find that pretty amazing. So Bungie has come out with another one, Destiny, and I'm really looking forward to that. And what they've done is they've upped that level of precision in a way that I actually didn't feel was possible. And then the other thing they did is they married it with real stuff. So I'm looking forward to seeing where that one's going. But finally, I have to say one last image is I love Mass Effect. I still love Mass Effect 3. I love the way in which it interacts. And of course, there's the Dragon Age, which is the other one that they produced. So over that journey, I went from being a parent that said, no video games, absolutely none. Okay, all right, I'll let you play 1 hour a day from starting at 6 o'clock to, hey, could you play that one again? That's kind of cool. Could we kind of tell me about that? How does that work? You can do, okay, let me see. Say, could we set aside a couple hours on Saturday? All right, you guys can play all week if you want to. And if you can, a little bit of your my kids are homeschooled. Can you fit in a little bit of your homework during the day? Oh yeah, it can be in between games. That's okay. So that tells you where I'm from.
Do you guys have any overall opening statements?
No, I didn't. No, I don't. Because I don't have any sort of similar experience with point of view one-player games where you navigate through space. So I can't agree or disagree. But I think that we could unpack your question a little bit more. And in terms of relating it back to architecture, do we talk about this as something that is visualization, or do we talk about this as entertainment, or how this might service humanity, or how I totally forgot. Or how it is a immaterial, disembodied social space. That was my last one. Right, so, because for me, cinema is primarily a tool of entertainment, fantasy, disembodied fantasy, materialization of dreamland, and architecture is primarily a service industry, right? One is disembodied, one is embodied. And so where this crosses over in being useful, right, is definitely, I think, the question that we're posing today. You guys get, like, I have to gather.
I think an overall opening statement or question could be, so first of all, do you guys believe it is a valid form of architecture? A.
No.
No. Okay. Why?
I think when you say virtual, right, we actually saying that it's not real. So there's a discrepancies. All of these, there's a lot of computing technology actually coming to play. But in a computer science or that directions, virtual reality start as this is virtual. So when you're playing a game, although it looks like real, but they actually somehow make them, this is not the real life. So there's a discrepancy to it. On the other side, there's the other thing called simulated reality, which is actually focused to the indistinguishable from the reality. It's kind of mixed conditions. So the answer is no. It's actually two different things, right? It's reality and this is virtual reality, right? So if somebody starts mixing it, then we have some problems.
No. Okay, by when I say no, I'm saying like 90% no, right? Sure, there are outliers, paper architecture, utilizing the format of the animated moving image or the piece of paper to take architecture to its fullest possibilities, right? But those are for outliers. That is not our main thrust, right? So it's not terrible. I mean, it's not even invalid. It's just that it's a sideline for me. Will it always be that way? Probably not. But it may be 100, 200 years before it actually becomes truly integrated. Because what I think has to happen first, I think that synthetic realities will develop first through biology. And that architecture is a response to material and to the body, and architecture will then take hold of the new bodies that it needs to respond to. I really think change will occur molecularly, and architecture through smart materials, through like this kind of small scale interaction, combined with molecular biology, engineering. That is where sort of the synthetic is really going to cross over into our field. In terms of a visualization tool, I think it's okay. It's hyperrealism, which has its uses, right? But it's, for me, the fact that it's so constantly disembodied, that it's only a space of the mind, and that the way architects sort of interact with it currently is as a production designer, as they do for films, right? It's still always subjugated by the primacy of the fantasy, of the entertainment aspect of these virtual worlds. Now, if you want to talk about it as a theoretical communal space, that's something very different. The ability to interact with people, to condense space across the world and interact with people that are across on the other side of the planet and make communal decisions, then to me that's actually an entirely different conversation. And in that case, the actual virtual space almost doesn't matter as long as it's sort of just cueing us into feeling a communal space that we're sort of familiar with. Because the actual virtual experience is already so disembodied that I think you need familiar reference in order to fully immerse yourself and believe that you are sitting next to somebody else or kind of feel that kind of community.
So I guess I'm the odd person out because I actually think that the two are totally integrated. I don't think that you can, I don't think that, well, let me back up a second. Tarkovsky talks about filmmaking as sculpting in time. When we think about the way in which architecture evolves, whether we're talking about the marsh of the Beaux-Arts, or we're talking about the diagram of modernism, or we're talking about the flow of space in contemporary architecture, we're talking about a sequence of experience that are part of the way we think of architecture as designers. Now, when one thinks about putting together a video game, one can make a game that it does not have a spatial component. But even if we're talking, let's talk about a couple of different games. If we're talking about games like Assassin's Creed, it's all about the space because the space controls the action. If we're talking about something like EVE Online, which has at sometimes 65,000 players at one time, it's a massive multiplayer online game, a role-playing game. We're talking about a space which is literally space, but it's also structured numerically. It's structured by performances, and those performances are displayed literally in space. And you actually, as somebody who's working in that game, you are working in the space of those performances. Now, that's going the game way. If we turn it around the other way and look at architecture, I think one could make an argument that architecture's singular value, it's not singular value, let's say, one of its defining qualities is its tectonics, its materiality, and its presence. Now, we could define that from a Newtonian point of view and say that that basically materials are real, and materials that aren't real aren't. But there's evidence that from wayfinding experiments, for example, that virtual realities, virtual environments, I should say, do have statistically the same kinds of effects on people and on people's perceptions as real spaces. It's not that they're the same, they're definitely different, so I agree with that. But while it is true that architecture plays a role in the way we make games, it is also true that games, just like movies, the example of Tarkovsky, that games, just like movies, are going to play a role in architecture. So where we exist in that as a profession may not be as discrete as we may wish to make it. And as somebody who's very interested in the physical quality of architecture, I would like to be able to say that no, this is not architecture because it's non-material. But having my personal experience through gaming, and to some extent, some of your professors, Glenn Hill and Saif Haq, have been through this in a more scientific way and have demonstrated about a decade ago that indeed virtual environments can elicit some of the same either good things or confusions that real environments do. So I guess my view is that that the two are not as discrete as maybe I would wish they would be, that they're actually interacting. And I would also say this, that the effect that games have, these virtual or synthetic realities have on you as designers is powerful. And that will be very much the way in which you begin to configure architecture. Your generation will think about architecture and configure it in a different way because of your exposure to these synthetic realities. And I'll give, as a trite example, one of my good friends, Michael Malone, excellent architect in Dallas, sits on the K-Rob jury. You may know that Ken Roberts of the K-Rob jury is it's a competition every year for drawing associated with architecture. And there are categories that deal with that are student-based, and then there are professional categories. And Michael was on the jury, and he said that he could tell immediately if it was somebody from the profession or if it was a student. He said because all the student drawings were dystopic. It looked like they all came from some apocalyptic view of architecture's role in the world, like Mass Effect or Halo or something like that. So I suppose then, I said it was a trite example, it does demonstrate that you all, your generation, are indeed impacted by the circulation of images which move through these synthetic realities. I would say they would have to have an impact on your architecture, scary as that might be.
Are you talking primarily about the point of view, one-player games, and the actual moving through the architecture?
Let's see. There's single-person games where there's a campaign. There are multiplayer games where, for example, in Dota, you're in teams of, is it 3 to 3 or 4, where you move through a map. There are sandbox games which don't have a campaign, but what you do is what you discover. Destiny is a sandbox game. There are games where you actually make the map, like Forge and Halo has where you can actually make the map and then you invite people to play in it. So in some ways, so I guess, I think there are levels. There's some levels where indeed all it is just a simple first-person shooter and you're just going to do stuff. Some of them have a behavioral content that's interactive, in which case the storyline actually changes depending upon the choices you make.
Okay, so it's like a choose-your-own-adventure. It's not a book; it's a video game,
right?
Where your decisions then change the outcome.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of it affecting how they design, it does seem like we also need to classify the difference between the interior and the exterior view of the synthetic realities, like the primacy of the point of view, that it is me and it is I am moving through this space, and it is, and there's before video games, there were film directors that experimented with shooting entire sequences or whole movies with the point of view, so that the narrator is right behind the camera and you, total immersion, it's you in the driving seat. And so, yeah, so architecture does start to become sequenced through experience, through that, the point of view, moving through. But the problem, I think, and maybe technology will get better as we go, is that it is still disembodied. Your body is still sitting in your chair in your air-conditioned room with your snack right here and the toilet right there, and all your bodily needs are taken care of, and you navigate through the space, you never get tired. Well, I guess that's not true. They probably have things like, oh, you gotta slow down. But you don't feel that. You know, you should have to like pedal the game or something. Anyways, there's still a disconnect to me. And it's still kind of hard for me to see how it's generative rather than just reactionary. But there are synthetic tools such as, meaning like we just keep recreating what we already know inside these virtual worlds, other than the kind of like crazy dystopic, horrible worlds that you see. But other possibilities include actually, there's a machine up in Canada called Sandy, and it allows you to draw in space. So you can, it's synthetic and you're drawing, but you're drawing in a virtual, you're actually drawing real space up and then a virtual space on screen. So for architects, that might be a more useful tool to use than just a series of cinema screens. Like, now I have this POV into this room and this POV, but actually crafting the space three-dimensionally through drawing.
Yeah, I think currently we talk too much about the games. Right? Virtual realities, yes, a lot of part goes into the game industries, but also there is a simulation part that actually sometimes, when the simulation comes in, that's the question about validity comes in directly, because there's a couple of research kind of projects. One is called HAZMAT, that's after 9/11. With DARPA, actually they build a virtual kind of conditioned building. The hazardous condition happens, how people evacuate or how firemen actually react to that situations. Obviously with the goggles, and then they're going into that conditions. And some recent one is called, I think it's called the Phobos something. It's an anxiety management kind of, it's a psychological thing. So this patient comes in and they're going into this virtual world with some situation they have a fear, and they're trying to overcome that conditions. So when that direction, virtual reality goes in, then validity comes into play, and because it's a scientific matters.
Yeah. Question over here.
Not really a question, but a statement. They are still studying the same kind of technology for those first-person shooter games where it's a treadmill and virtual reality goggles, but they take it a step further to the fact that they actually have paintball guns set up all around. So when you are playing this first-person shooter, if you're shot in the game, you are shot where you are in real life. In saying that, though, this same technology could be applied to our architectural design, where you could walk through your design spaces. I don't know if that's where you're getting it.
What is interesting about that thing is, like you just touched it a couple of minutes ago, actually it's in your surroundings. You're only moving into surroundings, but in your mind, you're going into the other side of the world or in the universe, and then the distance becomes obsolete. Right?
And there's actual risk involved. Like there's consequences. That's what I worry about in virtual reality, is that you're too removed from the actual consequences of your actions. It's a great place to visualize and play and imagine, but in the end, we're not. We're still made of flesh and bone, and so we're still in this world for at least another couple hundred years.
Well, some food for thought maybe would be, I remember we had a conversation before, and you posed a question, why is our generation so enthralled by dystopias. And at the time, I hadn't really thought about it. And now I've kind of read over a couple things and the reasons, because so you have this idea of decoding the flows. So decoding the flows of society itself, right? So now we're in this civilized society, and Homo sapiens, we have certain needs that we want to kind of express ourselves in particular ways. But because we're now in this civilized society, we don't have the means of, being violent or getting away from our everyday. So the point of games actually is to be a dystopia, to get away from, your own kind of reality. So it may be disembodied, but there's a lot of people, especially in games like Second Life, they literally will stay inside of their home and believe that that's really their life. That is their life, not because they're actively walking around and touching things, but because in their mind they're so active with it. So a dystopia would be to get away or decode our own flows. And that, yes, that's why it is so scary that we'd be going in that direction, but
there's another place where architecture and virtual realities cross, and that is in ideologies. Basically, architecture, even at a very simple level, is within the designer, it's an ideological exploration. I mean, let's face it, when you sit down to work with somebody and you're working with your client, you're working on the basis of certain ideological assumptions about your world, your client's world, and the outcome that you like to have. Dystopia is a negative ideology, but nonetheless, it's a search for, if you will, an ideological baseline that is, I would argue, just like I've argued about beauty, that kind of search is actually built into us. It's part of the way in which our brain works, and so to some extent, these two, the use of virtual realities and architecture, well, again, I don't think they're discrete. I think that they overlap. They're not part of the same thing, but the way in which we work with them is a lot closer together. And I guess just for a later discussion, y'all should see the videos, the TED Talks of Jane McGonigal, where she talks about how gaming can save the world, and she talks about how she can in 15 minutes give everybody 7 extra minutes on their life, and actually how games can actually increase your life by 10 years.
Can I make a comment? I think there's a few things being said that are related to gaming, and Kuhn wants to get off the gaming topic, and then I'm hearing Dean Vernoy mention ideological states and things of that nature. So I have a couple comments. I'll try not to be too long. Really three things come to mind. The first one is that your story about, you get like punched or hit when something happens, like the 4D theaters, when you go see a film, 4D, it's the same exact thing, they already have them. Those are actually, in my opinion, more synthetic for this reason, and I'm going to try to explain. That there's two examples that I can help explain this. One is through a Schumi example. Bernard Schumi talks about the architectural paradox. And the paradox of Schumi's writing is between two states of spaces. And they're essentially different kinds of space states. One is real and one is ideal. And so a real space is something that we inhabit, and it's a construct that's physically manipulated. The ideal is an ideological kind of statement or a mental construct. And he says that architecture fits in between those two. That architecture is a status at which it fits in between a physical reality versus a mental construct. At least that's the way I interpret it. And I think that's something that is kind of being touched upon, but I don't think it's an argue between, if it's material, it's real, because I would say that that's more synthetic of a quote-unquote simulation. And maybe what can be discussed is that state of in-betweenness of ideal and real spaces. And to me, that's where architecture lies. Architecture doesn't lie necessarily in a pure material state. It should accompany with it some kind of ideological discourse on the status of culture, politics, social issues, those kinds of things. Those are not physical states. So in a way, I agree probably more with Dean Verneuil that those things can be applicable to an architectural status. And then just last, but another reference that's I think a good one is Jeff Kipnis's idea about CORA, C-H-O-R-A, CORA. And he says that CORA is basically, I think Schumi and Kipnis are trying to say the same thing. And then third thing, last but not least, is another thing that I want to put into the panel is the issue of Sanford Quinter's idea about the time, and really the failure of time and the way our perception of time is the clock, and the birth of the notion of the clock. So anyway, there was something mentioned about time, so I wanted to mention that too. But anyway, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, if you go to Ethiopia, they have a different calendar. So it's 2014 now, but in Ethiopia it's like 2007. And they also have a different time. Not everywhere, of course, but in some places where actually, if I remember right, 1 o'clock starts when the sun comes up. So it's they have the same clock. The times are different. And again, it's not everywhere in the cities, of course, it's just like us. But the fact that when I was in Ethiopia, it made me realize that, you know, we live in this, as Jeff just pointed out, we live in an artificial construct. And we think about the way in which time and space works, which is fundamentally part of how we structure architecture, then it is indeed an artificial, at some level, it is an artificial construct. And in that way, our architecture is fundamentally it's a virtual environment. And as we design it, it's certainly virtual. We hope that it becomes real at some point, because our careers are better if it gets real. Last thought on this. Michael Benedict, very early, I worked 25 years ago. You may remember him, he was here earlier, wrote a book on cyberspace. Actually, he edited a book on cyberspace. But his chapter on cyberspace is really prescient. He talked about the way in which time and space could be warped by the lack of need for landmarks. Because if you're on your cell phone and you can tell people where you are, then meeting at a certain place at a certain time is less important than being constantly connected with somebody. And he also talked about the possibility that architecture's real goal in the world was to organize information, and that at some point the databases that we use now, which are so boring in the sense that they're structured linearly, might indeed be structured as three-dimensional space, hence the term cyberspace. Now, my argument with him at that time was 25 years ago, is pre-Halo. So my argument to him was, that's terrible, that's awful, because architecture is fundamentally tectonic, as I said earlier. And his response to me was, architecture is just boxes with holes in it. And that cyberspace has content. Should we be the ones maybe we should be licensed to create, maybe nobody should be allowed to create a virtual environment but us.
I think that's why we play, right? I mean, why we play games, or why we going into amusement park, or why we going into the movie films, going to see the film. It's basically you looking for a story, different stories, or you wanting to create in certain stories, right? The things that you play Halo and then you can actually reconstruct the space that you have been through. Or sometimes like there's a gaming convention and then there's a pro gamers comes out and then they did amazing actually sequence of the game and then they record the whole thing and then actually people looking at it, right? They're looking at it over and over. It's about the stories, right? I think that goes back to that colonial and kind of metaphor we're talking about. I don't want to be started as a negative point, but fundamentally mundane life, right? Unless you find some happiness, right? You need some stimulus. Then go to see a movie or film or you're creating something, right? Why are we doing a second life? Because I like to create something. I like to create something that I can just play with it. And then it's also disposable too. I can delete it, I can rebuild, I can reborn in a different avatar, and then play the different role, right? So, in some aspect, this virtual reality, I still don't understand what is synthetic reality, per se, right? And there's some interesting aspects to the architecture, and the architecture as we are creating a space, we are creating the stories or narratives about what's that happens in that space. It's somehow related for sure, right? But if we expanding certain boundaries as a synthetic as, okay, is it just a virtual, or can you start playing a word like augmented things? Then it becomes really this indistinguishable certain boundaries start coming in. Because it's not only real or virtual, but there's in between condition which is augmented side coming into our life. I think that may affects more into kind of literal architectural part as a space.
I believe that as an architect assessing a video game, you gain the understanding that yes, we are trying to design a space for people to experience, but in a video game, you design the game for people to experience a place or a thematic event, something special that is so much more specific than what you would find in reality, because sometimes in reality your context isn't as well connected. In virtual reality, you can make these connections so smoothly that it can either become something so beautiful or it can become something that is, I don't know how to say, it can be something that becomes cartoonish, I guess. But I don't know if there's a better way to say it. But you can either use this as a generative tool to start to tie in context in reality in a more rigorous way, or you can choose the more dangerous route and have an architecture with one character, but it is not enriching. If you assess games, you can understand that people understand place better in a video game than they do in real life, because you get to experience the haptic relationship of a building through touch, texture, sound, and all of these things, but a regular person who's not an architect cannot grasp why the way things are in a building.
But that's a little different though, because when you're going into the game, you need to figure out where you are. So you constantly looking in a way, constructing somehow blueprint of that space to win, right? It's not like we're just coming into the building right now, right?
Yeah, we're not trying to win every time we come to this.
Well, that would be a great way to approach life. I'm going to win. Let's go. How am I going to win this one? I don't know.
What is your definition on synthetic? What?
Was that my question?
No, I'm asking.
Do you say feedback or?
No, on
What is your definition on synthetic? What is synthetic to you?
Well, it comes from Greek, putting together. So so originally it was putting together materials, and then at a certain point in the larger production post-industrial revolution, it's putting together materials, usually non-natural materials, to replace natural materials. It's like the difference between leather and rawhide.
But it's putting something together.
Yeah.
Because from the discussion, we're talking about virtual realities and video games and film, and like there's a difference, I feel like, between virtual realities and synthetic realities, right?
I think that's go ahead, yeah.
Well, my understanding of synthetic is something that is constructed, something that is put together. And so in that way, cinema is a synthetic reality.
It doesn't matter whether we're talking about virtual realities from Man Ray, the avant-garde artist in the beginning part of the 20th century, or whether we're talking about virtual realities or Destiny. The reality, what's happening is we are putting together the assumptions we naturally have about the real world with assumptions that have to do implicitly with the narrative at hand. Okay. And so it is a synthesis. It is putting together of two things. It does have this artificial connotation that comes to mind right away. And that's a post-industrial revolution add-on connotation to it.
Maybe some of the concerns and the issues is that trying to make a distinction between real world and not. You know, we hear students say all the time, like, "Oh, we're doing a real project," and it's like, well, the model you're making is real, isn't it? The idea you have is real. So I wonder if you have a comment maybe on that.
Well,
go ahead.
You mentioned it, and I think, Jeff, when you're talking about the in-betweenness, I think narrative really is the main idea here, that the future imaginings, or the place where the moment before architecture becomes material and it's still ideological, even that ideology is a narrative. It's like, and by narrative I mean I imply a desire. We craft narratives because we want. There's an agency implied, and like I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think
there's a first-person narrative somehow involved, and you might say, well, my narrative also applies to other people, but it's still the theoretician's narrative, it's still the filmmaker's narrative, and it's still the gamer creating a narrative for others to experience. And in that way, I think we try on other worlds because we narrate them. Dystopias, to me, are narratives of a future world.
But as a materialist, we recognize our mind to be a physical, biological simulation. And if you think about it as a materialist, it is real. And so the firing of, whatever, I'm not, but the firing of ideas off are chemical reactions. And those chemicals are very much real. And so my take, and I don't know, you all feel maybe differently, but that is still ideas, narratives, those are very much real, and they come from very seriously physical properties that exist. And I'm not sure about the whole gaming relationship, but I certainly think a thought is a physical, very much physical.
I mean,
I like the word that Tara said a minute ago, agency. I mean, the reality of it is, as architects, one of the great, we're not going to make a lot of money, but we live in a world. I'm sorry, guys.
Only behind closed doors.
But if you do make money, I'm going to hear about it, and I'm going to be saying, could you give some
If you
money?
do, you're a sellout.
Yeah. So the agency, I think that's a really important observation, Terry, because I think we live in a world of agency. That's one of the great benefits of being an architect. We are agents. We're agents of change. But most population do not live in a world of agency. So finding agency, as Jeff just said, I think is a very powerful part of finding oneself. There are moments that are physical and natural. The Columbia River Gorge is one of those things that you'll never forget. And so, the Eiffel Tower, especially if you see it from across the Seine, is something that you'll never forget. Those are in themselves moments of agency because they make you feel alive. There are, when one is involved in personal contact, that is a form of agency. Holding somebody's hand, a pat on the shoulder. Those are moments of agency that, as Jeff just pointed out, have specific chemical reactions that happen in your brain. And if we didn't have that in our brain, that rewarded those moments, either natural, architectural, or virtual, then those chemical reactions would not happen. And if our brain was not made up to respond to those chemical reactions, we would have vanished as a race a long time ago. These narratives, these moments of agency, are essential to our psychological and social well-being. And you talk about this, I love this design, society, and technology, because I've never kind of quite thought of them as a triad, but if you put them together and you start thinking about what we do as architects, not from the point of view of architecture, but from the point of view of environmental sensitivities, that's a pretty interesting way to look at it. And whether we're doing it virtually or whether we're doing it we're actually nailing the pieces of the building together, that's what we're engaged in. So again, I guess I continually see these things folding into each other as opposed to being separate.
So then I kind of have a question then, since you know, these things fold into each other, and if our architecture is always sort of a response to our culture, which is why I mentioned the triad, if we as a generation starts changing our ideas and how we see things, whether it be first person, dystopias, it doesn't matter if you disagree with how these virtual or augmented realities are working architecturally or spatially, but they are happening and they are part of our architecture. So my question is, do you think the way that we start going through those spaces virtually and the way we start thinking about them and the way that we start interacting each other will start affecting our physical configuration or process of architecture?
Yeah, I think both. I I mean, I just think that you all are wired differently. And here's the other thing. You're all in your 20s. And so, but people who are 12, they're even wired differently from you. And so I think, it changes the way we think about space. It changes the way we think about the world. And the other thing that my poor colleagues, Clifton has heard me talk about forever, he's probably, is that I believe that there's actually a discipline. We talk about virtual environments, there's actually a discipline about them that is a discipline that is a cognitive discipline that is distinct in the world. And it may be the most powerful discipline we've seen since being able to just draw something on the inside of a cave.
I mean, there's a discipline which is a neuropsychological department. When we're talking about the chemicals in the brain, so when simulated reality comes in, it's actually brain-computer interactions, and that has been developed for a while. I mean, for the extent some movies like, I don't know, like Sleep Dealer, I mean, everybody going into with the injection and the brain thinking actually, do the walk and everything, and then when the machine died, actually the people dies too because of this impact of it. So, on some aspect, technology is somehow in a scary, somehow in a dangerous point. But also there's things we can think about it. And the movie I just talked about, Sleep Dealer, is also about that. Actually what they are consuming and then what they are selling is the ideas or thinking and stories or creativities. So it's very interesting because it's not about the physicality or something. It's about that how human being is thinking. It becomes a matter, great matter. And I think that's become, I mean, as a designers, right? It's actually about that thinking ideas and making things. So creativity is the most of the matters, and then that can be mixed with the virtual reality. And you just made a couple of times, minutes ago, you mentioned about like three-dimensionally actually making paintings, right? The things called leap motion. Can you Google it? LEAP, I think. It's a really, simple device, but there's a sensing device. You put your hands on it, and it actually recognizes every joint on your hand. And then there is a certain tools that kind of ball is in the space, and then you touches it, and then sculpting with your hand. That's two-dimensional currently, but some of the apps actually, they can do three-dimensionally too.
So imagine this is a field of points. That was a field of points. And then you're trying to find information like in a library. I mean, one of the problems I have with the internet is it's so linear. But if you could move into information space the way you can in a library and be able to move through it and be able to find things. And I mean, I used to like going to the library because I could walk around the stacks and find something or a project I was working on that was clearly not what I went to the library for.
And good things about this, actually, you can do like API, which is application program interface, using processing. So you can build up your own program.
Well, Andrew, the whole going through the library and discovering things you weren't looking for, we're nearing that, with augmented reality, Google Glass, and just the New York Times just today released, and it's with Shell Oil, an advert. It was actually it's a print. You get a print and you have an app on your phone and you can kind of scan it and it'll bring up things on your phone. So that, Google Glass is trying to, we've seen it in movies for decades now, when you kind of zoom in on something and it brings them up, through scaling, right? It kind of zooms in and brings a new scale into view, a micro scale of information. So, I think there's a potential of crafting information realms around us that still allow for
But what's that going to do with
curiosity?
architecture
Well, that's why I think this all comes back to the body. Because, even if you argue that thoughts are material because of the micromolecular interactions, it's still the body. And these virtual worlds currently are accessible to us because we're in a house. We are still experiencing the virtual world with a physical body inside of a physical space. It's just so easy for us to forget about our body, actually, right? We love movies. For 2 hours, you forget, unless the chair is really uncomfortable, if the movie is really good, you're completely immersed and you forget your body. Same with the virtual reality, even though there's blendings of being able to walk, have the gear on your arms and your head and be able to walk while you're doing the virtual reality. That's why I think the real future of architecture in synthetic realities is actually not specifically architecture, but more design, and design in conjunction with changing physical bodies and augmented bodies. And as our bodies develop and change, or actually, we're going to be designing the changes. We're too impatient to let evolution keep going, and we're actually going to instigate new changes in the body by looking closer and closer at the molecule, at DNA blocks, building bio blocks, making little bio machines. There's a yearly competition called iGEM. I guess you could Google that. It takes place in Boston.
How do you spell it?
iGEM. International Genetic Engineered Machine. Yeah, so the iGEM Jamboree or competition. Let's all go.
Just go back.
I agree. The way in which we structure the world is the way in which we inhabit it. So, yeah, I don't see how virtual realities can get away from the fact that our haptic sense, our sense of space, our sense of scale are all dependent on our corporal presence. So they're going to have to be connected to the body. So I completely agree with that.
We had a question over here.
Can you elaborate more on how the discipline of architecture is the most powerful discipline since cave paintings, please? I believe that was your.
Since cavemen, yeah, right, yeah.
Can you just elaborate more on how that may be true?
I'm not sure that I put it exactly that way, so I'm trying to think of it exactly that way. I think There are lots of studies that show that we structure information by space. A classic technique for actors and actresses is to memorize their lines according to where they are on the stage. And that how we perceive things in space is a part of, as Tara just said, it's a part of our body presence in the world. So I don't think architecture, actually what I normally say is that before everything there was art. Art preceded architecture, philosophy, the first science, and religion, the other science. So, but architecture is a vehicle for all of that. Was it Voltaire who said that with the printing press, this will kill that, meaning the death of the cathedral?
Balzac.
Was it Balzac? It was one of those French guys.
Yeah.
But then Derrida, no, thank you, actually. No, I'm not going to talk about Derrida. We'll talk to her. But I think what we're seeing today is a change, and that was just a change in paradigm. Did architecture go away? No, it adapted. Is architecture, there was a point in my life in the 50s when the comment was industrial designers were going to take over everything. And we don't need architects anymore because industrial designers are going to be, it was a race between the industrial designers and the ad men. Well, it turns out actually we survived. I think we'll survive this paradigm shift because it's fundamentally about the body. So I think I see architecture as a discipline, and it's a discipline that it doesn't invade society and culture, it structures society and culture. It doesn't have to be physical to do that.
I have another question over here.
Me? Okay.
I have
Okay, well, I think this is something we've been dancing around a little bit, but I think to distinguish physical realities and the synthetic reality is to say that synthetic realities are less than a proving ground. I think that synthetic realities are the manifestation of what we can do, as opposed to, say, in the past we would design and plan and section, and maybe we would design and create a building, and then we would decide what a building means. But to create a synthetic reality is to allow somebody to understand an emotion without having to create a physical manifestation of that ideal. So, and I'm sorry that I don't have this composed as well as I wish, but like,
I think that's a good question. A student of mine last night said he was interested in the sentiment of the projects that he created.
I would say that architecture is the art of eliciting emotion. And regardless of whether you say less is more or less is a bore, the point is, if you can create an environment in which you elicit an emotion, in which you make people feel the way you're supposed to, that it doesn't matter whether something is physical or synthetic. The idea is that you have created something that is real. Synthetic realities and physical realities are nothing more than digital and physical. It's not different. It's the same thing. It's just that one is not
I agree with you. I want to ask you now, how long do you want to have that effect?
Well, that's to say that one is better than the other.
Well, maybe it is, though. Maybe.
But given that's
the ephemeral effect versus the sustained effect.
Sure.
Right? And the movie there's another science fiction movie where people are inside their avatars and they just they're in dark rooms and they don't ever want to unplug. So if you can, there's a possibility of that, right?
Sure.
But there's a point to me where visualization ends. It's created and then it's put out there.
Sure.
And it's experienced again, you revisit. To me, it's just a much more broken type type of continuity than sort of a physical reality.
I mean, essentially, in a digital environment, you can continue to create to your heart's content. You would never have to actually make that building real. And I think, in a sense, as architects, it's not our place to just simply get lost in our ideas. We have to create, otherwise our profession wouldn't exist.
I think I have one last closing question to kind of counter that, and it's the question of, in between both of your comments, is using architecture in the way that he is talking about ethical, because we are disconnecting ourselves from our physical realm.
In regards to that, I would say, as someone who has played, I realize we're not talking solely about video games, but I have played Assassin's Creed, the entire series, through the completion from 9th century India all the way to 15th century Florence. And I know that when I'm interacting with these spaces, I can feel them. I'm not just playing a game. There are real architects who are designing these levels, and they put real intent and real emotion behind them. It's not that synthetic realities are less than a physical manifestation of an idea. They are simply digital. And while architects may be...
You feel them because you already have muscle memory. You are applying a memory of your previous physical body to these new spaces.
Sure.
Is it ethical? Hell yeah. Until we're forcing people to visit our virtual worlds, it is ethical. Sure. You should be allowed to imagine whatever you want. That's what I mean.
About architecture that never happens, like Levi's Woods, like would that be synthetical?
Say that again, I couldn't hear you.
What?
She said architecture that never happens.
Like Levi's Woods, like that never happened. So unless you think it really happened throughout drawings, I mean, is that synthetical?
Well, Jeff left. Jeff would say, yeah, that's real. I don't think it's real. I think it's an idea, and it's manifested in some kind of medium. But I think he and I have differing opinions on what reality is. One place where I do think, if we're looking for something like really constructive here, where I do think synthetic realities is quite helpful to the designer, is that it's a place where you can investigate a scale that you couldn't work with otherwise. Like the way we use animation and CGI to help us visualize the micro scale of the body and how things inside the body work. We could also zoom in really small to the actual material molecules that are being developed and start working small to big instead of big to small.
Professor Ellis?
I don't think it's very productive to ask whether virtual reality is as valid as architecture, because I think that you can't, it's apples and oranges, you really can't compare the two. We've been trying to, and we know the differences. I think most of us agree that you exist, and that was real, right? I could also make you in a virtual thing and shoot you, but that would not be real, much to your benefit. I think that a more productive question would be, and we started that here a minute ago, was how does the virtual inform the real? How does virtual realities that we create, how might they inform architecture, or the other way around? Kuhn was talking about the simulated reality. And certainly there's validity in that in a training ground, in a training experience. And maybe one day we'll get to the holodeck. I don't know, but not in my lifetime. But I think
want to get to the Battlestar Galactica projection system, where I can make this a pretty, you all look beautiful.
Yeah.
There's trees.
They're talking about making the inside of an airplane, taking all the windows out of the airplane and projecting on the, just projecting what is out there on the surface of the inside of the fuselage. Absolutely terrified. But hey, look, Glenn Hill, 12 years ago, Glenn Hill figured out how to, sorry, I'm required to leave.
This can be your closing statement.
Beat me out. 12 years ago, Glenn Hill figured out how to create 3D images from a desktop computer without having to have elaborate computation, without having to have elaborate projection systems, but just simply 3D, which seemed like a great idea. So we presented it. I said we. I thought, this is a great idea. Let's present it at the Texas Society of Architects annual conference. So he did. He presented it to probably 500 people. And I could tell that they completely didn't get it. Absolutely didn't get it. It just, and all they could think of was all the money it must take to do that. That's all they could think about. And they'd say, well, I don't need that because we can just do our regular presentation drawings. And I was thinking, what a waste of, I mean, the time is not right. But this is what I told the people who were critical of that. I said, look, you may not like it now, but I got news for you. There's a generation of people coming up who are immersed every day in complex environments. And when they go into an architect's office and they sit down and they say, I want to know what this is going to look like. I'm going to make the most important investment in my life. I want to know that it has the sensitivity, that has the sentiment that I want to see in my building. And if all those architects can do, who are my age, if all they can do is just do a sketch or do a Revit model, they should be out of business because those clients are going to want more. I apologize.
Do you guys have any quick closing statements?
No.
I think, virtual reality, I still think that's why we call it virtual reality, because it's virtual. And there's a clear distinction to it. And when it's going into simulated reality or augmented reality, there's a kind of sense of the breaking boundaries. So that's the one, physical aspect to it. And if we expanding kind of our conversation into, how virtual reality or dystopias is drawn into that game or the other things affects your design kind of directions. I mean, I think there's a different also conversations, right? So there's things of that. And then also how they relate to the colonial or more actual thing. That's totally, I think, also different thing socially too. Because, so it's really kind of mix of many issues and ideas.
Yeah.
Yes, but I believe the Matt talking about the kind of joy or the things that you're experiencing from that game, and the things that you actually see the apple from the other side of the sand. I think that's different, because the things we talk about ephemeral, it goes away quickly. It's related to those kind of things. Right? I mean, you can raise your pet in a virtual world, right? And in Japan, there was something called Tamaguchi, which is a small pet thing. Like, sometimes you abandon them and kill them.
Yeah, mine would always die.
But the sorrow doesn't really go as your pet that you raise 7 years. Right? So it's just different. And you feel like maybe it's the same, but there's about actual thing and the slowness coming to play and actual the time comes in.
You can go deeper north if you need to. Yeah, we can end it.